going live. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Talking. Can you hear me now? All right. Sweet. All right. So just mute the stream.
And Geoff, you'll hold this too when you're talking, because this is for the live
I
streaming.
think he has one for me, actually.
No, that's for the in here.
I have two.
He has two.
I have
And,
two.
oh, you have?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, yeah. Yours too? Yeah, too.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Yael Aronoff. I'm the director of the Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel. I'm thrilled to have a former student here, Geoffrey Levin, talking about his newly published book, Our Palestine Question, Israel and American Jewish Dissent, 1948 to 1978. We have the book here as well. But before we get started, I just wanted to have a quick announcement that our last event for the semester is going to be on Tuesday. It's going to be in the Lincoln Room in Kellogg, and it's going to be Professor Alexandra Garbarini talking about Holocaust diaries and Holocaust histories. So I encourage everyone to come to that lecture. We're also having our Sterling Institute Undergraduate Research Conference tomorrow from 9 to noon in Club Spartan right here. And from 12 to 1, we're having a complimentary lunch for students and faculty. So if you want to support your fellow students that you know or just are interested, please come. So I'll start with a personal note because he has all this professional background now. But Geoff Levin was a student here in James Madison College, and he was a Jewish Studies minor who was also awarded a Jewish Studies Student Achievement Award while he was here. I was really lucky to have Geoff in 3 classes. One was the Israeli Politics, Cultures, and Society class, and we did simulations of different political parties and simulations of forming coalitions, and then Geoff adapted those simulations in some of the courses he later taught as a professor now in Emory University. He took a Middle East class that I taught, in which I think you were looking at Syrian interests and simulations of former kind of peace negotiations that had been taking place between Israel and Syria. And he took my senior seminar. And I think in that class, well, I know that he wrote an incredible research paper that focused on how Israel, when it made, can you turn the phone? So sorry for that. Over here. Yeah, just over here is one. Sorry for that. So he wrote a fantastic, extensive research paper, how when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza in 2005, it really should have given a lot more attention to coordinating it with the Palestinian Authority, and we would have had better results. And obviously there are tragic implications that we see today. And actually, although some students, and I encourage all students who want to do that, to try to get your research published in an undergraduate research outlet, which is a great thing that a lot of students don't think about. But Geoff actually submitted that paper that he adapted afterwards to a scholarly peer-reviewed referee journal from his senior seminar. I think it was published in Israel Studies or Israel Studies Review. And so that was kind of incredible. So that was Geoff's start, but let me give his current way back at MSU and at James Madison College. But he is now a historian. Oh, wait, I'm looking at. Oh, one more thing I wanted to announce, just because I think it's really important. It's not something the Sterling Institute sponsored, but it's something we're endorsing, that all weekend long on Saturday and Sunday this weekend, there's a Palestinian-Israeli peace-building partnerships that include a lot of Palestinian and Israeli peace-building groups, including Standing Together that we heard from last week, I believe. It's organized by the Common Bond Institute, the International Humanistic Psychology Association, and the Michigan State University Department of Psychiatry. And they have 10 organizations they're working with. So I just wanted to highlight that for those of you who are interested in those kinds of things, you actually could go for part of the weekend or all of the weekend. I think on Sunday it might be on Zoom and on Saturday, but we have flyers outside for that. So Dr. Geoffrey Levin is assistant professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Jewish Studies at Emory University in Atlanta. and he's the director of undergraduate engagement at Emory's Tam Institute for Jewish Studies. This is his first book, our Palestine Question, Israel-American Jewish Dissent, 1948 to 1978, and it was just published this past fall by Yale University Press. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Center for Jewish Studies in 2019 to 20, and he has a PhD in Jewish history from New York University, and also studied at Johns Hopkins University and the University of Haifa. So while he was here, he was a major in international relations and minored in political economy and Jewish studies. This talk is co-sponsored by James Madison College, the College of Arts and Letters, the College of Social Science, the Residential College of Arts and Humanities, International Studies and Programs, the Department of History, and the Center for, and the Asian Studies Center. So thanks. We're all really thrilled that you're here. There's so much more I'd like to say to Geoff, but don't want to go on, and we're really thrilled to hear about your thought-provoking work. So Dr. Levin, he's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then I'll spend the next 20 minutes asking him some questions, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So thank you so much for coming back to your alma mater and having us here. Yeah.
Thank you. I have my gun.
Oh, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Yael, and really thank you to everyone here at the Sterling Institute who made this happen. Thank you all for coming, especially, oh, this is off. Okay. Great. Thank you for making this live streaming possible. And again, really thank you everyone for coming. I know it's been such a hard year for people in the Middle East, for those here who know people are affected by the violence or sort of, you know, the discourse here, which has been so challenging. As you'll see, this book is really related to the history of all of that. I'm going to just give you a little bit of a taste of the book, really first by saying its main points, then kind of transitioning into a few sort of key chapters before we get into a conversation where I think we can kind of broaden our perspective on what this book means in general and at this moment. I just want to also say just how special it is to be here. This literally returning home. I lived on the 4th floor of this building 15 years ago. So I spent a few minutes wandering the halls with nostalgia. So again, thank you. So this book is a history, and it's a history that goes into the lives of individuals. 5 of the 6 chapters really focus in on 1 or 2 people. This is a work of history that involved really diving in deep into the archive. So these are largely people, I'll tell you who they are soon, largely people who have never been heard of, even in some cases by scholars in the field. So we'll get into the stories of a few of them, but kind of to tell you first kind of the main points in bringing these stories from the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s to light. One is that American Jewish dissent and sort of concern for Palestinians or dissent over Israel's policies towards the Palestinians isn't something that started last year or started 20 years ago or started in the 70s. It goes back to 1948 to the beginning of the Palestinian refugee issue and Israel's creation. So I bring these stories of these lesser-known people to light, and I show that these people who were involved in raising various Palestinian rights concerns were often American Jews who were deeply involved in the issue, people who spent months or years in Mandate Palestine or Israel or the Palestinian territories. A third sort of main point, maybe sort of a juicier point in the book, is that during this time period, from the 40s to the 70s, American Jewish engagement was both facilitated but also limited by state actors, by different governments. You'll hear more a little bit about the role of Israeli diplomats in sort of constraining or sidelining certain voices, but the CIA plays a role. The Arab League comes up in the book. And a fourth point, which I didn't really make as clear up front in the book, but I think has attracted a lot of attention now, is the ways in which discourses about anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism were quite different in the 50s, especially in relation to what the sort of leading American Jewish groups were saying. So these different main characters I talk about, I'll mention briefly, and then I'll talk about a couple of them. My sort of main character here, who I'll talk more about, is a guy named Don Peretz. He was born in 1922 in Baltimore to a father who was of Jerusalem Sephardic background. The family lived in Ottoman Palestine for 400 years before his father came to America. He is the first person to write a scholarly book on the Palestinian refugee issue. I'll get a lot more into him soon. The second chapter deals with a Yiddish journalist named William Zuckerman, who was active in Europe for a long time, moves back to the US. He grew up in America, moves back to the US in 1940s, and founds the first the newspaper, a Jewish newspaper that's most involved in raising Palestinian refugee issues. He's very upset that Israel is not letting Palestinian refugees back. He's very upset about Israel's policies toward Arab citizens and so forth. And so if I show how Israeli diplomats end up sort of sidelining him and working to get him push back against lose certain positions and so forth. I'll go into depth about a group called the American Jewish Committee. This is a sort of a leading figure in it, which is the subject of a multi-chapter arch, so we'll get into that. I felt very fortunate to have a chapter that really puts in the forefront a Palestinian voice, a lesser-known figure named Fayez Sayed, who grew up in Tiberias and became a refugee. His family became refugees. And I show his role in the 1950s as the leading Arab voice in the United States, but as someone who is in dialogue with American Jewish groups on how to, if he can, sort of make pro-Palestine arguments in a way that aren't anti-Semitic or aren't concerning American Jewish groups. And so that's his chapter. I talk about this group of anti-Zionist American Jewish, Reform rabbis who have certain entanglements with the CIA in the 50s, 60s. And then I sort of broaden out in the 70s after Israel captures the Palestinian-populated West Bank and Gaza, and talk about the rise and fall of a number of groups that sort of were Jewish groups that advanced sort of what we now call the two-state solution. So the first major Jewish voices in America to say, we believe there should be a Palestinian state next to Israel, and I'll talk more about how they should get sidelined. So a quick kind of segue. So I was here from 2007 to 2011. If you come tomorrow, you'll hear more about my trajectory as an international relations major. So I thought I'd go into international relations. Then I went to a PhD and thought I was going to do diplomatic history at NYU. But I took a course my first year there where I learned about, I took a lot of great contemporary courses as an IR major, but got really, as a PhD student, much more into the history of Arabs in Israel, people who are of a Palestinian background, but are often called call themselves Israeli Arab. So if people are familiar with Israel, this population has had citizenship for the bulk of Israeli history. What a lot of people don't know, and I didn't really know until taking a course in my first year of grad school, is that for Israel's first 18 years, this population faced a lot of internal restrictions on their movement, and in many ways were not given sort of equal citizenship. So most Palestinians living in what became Israel became refugees. Those who didn't, the Israeli Arabs, got citizenship after 4 years, but lived under these restrictions where they couldn't, movement restrictions, permit system, all sort of land confiscation. And taking this course, I was really curious, what did Americans think about this? And I was in New York, not in DC. If I was in DC, I could have looked at the diplomatic files. But I was in New York, and all the great American Jewish archives are there. So if you don't know what archives are, they're very often just a depository where there are all these musty papers, from many decades ago that, maybe no one's looked at in 50, 60 years. And so I went in, and the group I decided to look for in this paper I wrote 10 years ago when I first started this project was the American Jewish Committee. People heard of this group today? AJC, it's a very prominent, sort of very mainstream American Jewish group. It's very pro-Israel today. It was, now it's one of many groups. It was then, but back in the 50s and earlier, it was the most prominent and influential group in terms of its access to the White House, in terms of its sort of funding. It had an affluent membership, influential people. It was founded initially to help Jews in Russia suffering from the pogroms, but also to push back against anti-Semitism, basically, in short, by arguing that Jews are, by nationality, they're American, and their main difference is religion, and understood protecting Jewish interest in the context of religious freedom. After World War II, they began viewing themselves much more as a universalist human rights group, working towards civil rights, global Jewish advocacy, but they labeled themselves up until 1967 as non-Zionist. So people are familiar with Zionist, people are familiar with anti-Zionist. For them, non-Zionist meant that they were Americans first, and even though they wanted to be supportive of Israel, they felt that the idea of Zionism implied that Jews' nationality was primarily their nationality as Jews, and were afraid or felt that Zionism got in the way of their loyalties to the United States, and thought maybe other Americans would view them negatively for that. So they also view themselves as maybe a more neutral arbiter on what American interests are, and they're the group who has the most access to the Eisenhower White House. So I was particularly interested in what they had to say. So I went in the archives, I found all these interesting documents. They're not sure how to relate to this new state after 1948. Do they call their committee on Israel the committee on impact, how Israel is impacting American Jews? Like, what is this? And so they're kind of have all these interesting conversations. But related to my interest, the rights of Israel's Arab citizens, I found that they were actually really concerned about this issue in the 1950s. The leaders went over there. They went on a delegation. They met with Arabs throughout Israel, learned about all these restrictions, and understood that didn't fit with sort of their broader human and civil rights issue, and even pressed Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to change Israel's entire policy toward its minority and Arabs in general. The son of a key AJC figure who became a vice president of the AJC himself, James Marshall, wrote like a 20-page report. He'd been to Israel many times, even before it was Israel, basically saying that this is not, this doesn't really fit with his idea of a liberal democratic state, and that he'd had all these meetings with Israeli politicians. He'd had these meetings with Arabs, and had this memo that he sent to Israel's prime minister office on how Israel should change its policies in his view. I found also, over the course of the years of my research, this interesting conversation where they're again pushing Israel. The leader of the agency is pushing Ben-Gurion to change his policies, and really fascinating conversations here. And then these are something that no one has written about before. So again, what is this book? It's not drawing from other, I do draw from other books, but a lot of it is just really new archival material. And I thought a lot about why are they doing this. One, is their own commitment to human rights and consistency. Two is they are concerned about Israel, even though they don't consider themselves Zionist, but they're also sort of concerned that criticism of Israel will contribute to anti-Semitism in the United States, and that right-wing anti-Semitic groups will take all these negative Israeli policies, including a massacre of Israeli Arabs that occurred in '56, and use it against American Jews. So, that's how I get more into the anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism debates. There's all these policy ideas this guy has, this leading figure. He puts a lot of thought of the AJC into Israel changing its policies, but basically the position of the response several months later from the Prime Minister's office is, you don't really understand this. And so the military government sort of continues, and they do some other things that I talk about in the book, and I'm happy to talk more about in Q&A, but again, it's sort of pushed back against. So that's James Marshall here. Again, that's how I got into this project. When I was actually at a conference with Yael Aronoff in 2015, we were sitting at a table, and she introduced me to someone who said, one of those guys from that period who you write about, he's still alive. His name is Don Peretz, and he's in his 90s. And he's like, I could put you in touch. So I get in touch with this 93-year-old named Don Peretz and talk to him on the phone. over the course of the next few years, I try to meet up with him. He passes away, but his wife lets me see lets me into their retirement community, and I look through all of his letters from 1940s. I find his name in Israeli diplomatic files, and he became sort of a main figure in the book. So he is, again, from the Sephardic Jerusalemite family on his father's side, Ashkenazi, typical American Jew on his mother's side, born in 1922. He is very interested in pacifism. He serves in Okinawa in World War II as an interpreter. He refuses to hold a gun because of his pacifistic beliefs. He decides to use his GI Bill benefits to study Hebrew University because he hears that there's figures there like Martin Buber and the University president Judah Magnus, who are interested in a binational sort of peaceful solution to one state and mandate Palestine for both Jews and Arabs, which is really inspiring to him. He goes there and becomes very intrigued by Zionism, but then very sort of disgusted by the way in which when the war breaks out, people in the Jewish community become very sort of anti-Arab in ways that trouble him. He gets briefly detained by an Arab militia, which is its own kind of side story, but he is very impacted by sort of the Palestinian refugee issue and decides to volunteer in 1949, the only American Jew to volunteer to help displaced Palestinians. So he spends 7 months helping them in 49, writes the first PhD dissertation on the Palestinian refugee issue, the first scholarly book on the issue, and then he gets hired by the American Jewish Committee, which is fascinating to me, AJC, in 56. And I decided I'd maybe do a chapter on him and on the Palestinian refugee issue. So people maybe know a thing or two. There's lots of Palestinian refugees today. So it originates from the 1948 war, when hundreds of thousands of people either fled or were forcibly displaced from their homes. 750,000, many of them ending up in surrounding Arab states. And I found that the AJC was interested in doing something about this, not in necessarily, this is him in Akka, in Akko, Peretz is right here, not in helping them return, but in philanthropically aiding Palestinian refugees. So they hire him, and he works on this Palestinian Refugee Aid Initiative that gets announced in 1956. And who doesn't really like this? Israeli diplomats. So I found all these Israeli diplomatic files. They're not liking what the AJC is doing. They want them to fire Peretz. There's this whole kind of saga and back and forth, like what are they doing? They're trying to have an independent American Jewish position. They should just not talk about this issue. And so he gets sort of sidelined internally. He can't work on these issues for the AJC. He has to have all of his material that he writes sort of read first by Israeli diplomats. And ultimately, when his book comes out on the Palestinian refugee issue, here again the first real scholarly book on the topic, published in 58, Israeli diplomats basically say, this is bad for Israel, you should let him go. And that's kind of the end of his chapter. So, a lot of my books in the 50s, the 60s, a lot of stuff's changing. A lot of American Jews are feeling much more comfortable with supporting Israel. There's much less of a concern about anti-Semitism related to American Jews' loyalty. As sort of American Jews, we can hear from a professor of American Jewish history how American Jews in Israel become much a deeper part of American Jewish sort of white majority culture. Cultural icons of Israel become just much more popular to American Jews and also to non-Jewish Americans. So in my last chapter, I go into this new period, which sort of comes after the 1967 war. So not a lot of people are active in Palestinian rights issues in the American Jewish community, because it's not a major thing, as it would be after Israel after 67, takes control of these two, territories, the West Bank and Gaza, which are, essentially Palestinian populated, hundreds of thousands more Palestinians millions even, become under their control without, getting citizenship. So there's a whole new issue, much greater international attention from the left, domestically and globally, from Palestinian actors like the PLO. There's a lot going on there. And I deal with a lot of American Jewish groups, some feminists who are American Jewish feminists who are on both sides of these issues. But I focused most in my last chapter on this first national American Jewish organization called Brera, which means choice. There is a choice or alternative to permanent warfare that arises in 1973, basically to say, amongst other things, that there's a Palestinian people and that Israel needs to do something to recognize that. So I looked at this organization, which had about 1,500 members and was sort of very active nationally in the mid-'70s. And I looked at sort of the core founders and staff members. And I found that a lot of them, even though some histories that have been written about them really said, oh, they're just like, lefties who are involved in American Jewish or American counterculture, actually the way the places these American Jews came to these conclusions was often by spending months or years in Israel or traveling to the West Bank, and got inspired in many ways internationally by the Israeli peace camp. So I sort of make this a much more international story. And that's sort of why they're supporting Palestinian self-determination and the creation of a Palestinian state, which was super controversial at the time, even what we call the two-state solution. Any sort of recognizing the PLO, anything that recognized that the Palestinians have legitimate aspirations was like extremely unpopular in America in the 70s, especially American Jewish community. But they noticed that a lot of these Israeli leftists who are inspiring them are arguing that Israel needs to act and even start meeting with the PLO. The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is very involved on the international stage, but also in attacks, militant attacks against and killing Israeli civilians. And so they're particularly unpopular. But the people who are involved, the Israeli, peace camp, including former Israeli generals, start meeting with them to try and talk about a solution. And so some of the members of this group, Brera, decide to do the same when they're invited to meet with two of the most moderate members of the PLO. There are a few other people at these meetings with the PLO in '76, and some of the people at these meetings reported this to some Israeli officials, and Israeli officials actually found leaked the names of the people involved in this to a young journalist named Wolf Blitzer, who reported it and became a huge controversy. All the other Jews sort of distanced themselves from the PLO. This group, Brera could not condemn, the idea of meeting with Palestinians, and it led to a major sort of negative campaign against Brera. And the group sort of, in the context of this and other issues, folded in 1977. And so I sort of talk in this international way about the rise and fall of Brera. So again, those are just a few tidbits. I really want to, at first we have a little bit of conversation between Yael and I, so she can ask more about them, and then we'll open up to you if you want me to go more in depth. I find when I try and cover everything, it just becomes a little too crazy. So anyway, thank you for listening to me, and we'll continue the conversation. Oh, I'm going to turn this off. Thank you.
Well, it's a fascinating book. I recommend it to all to read when you have a chance or during the summer if you don't have time now. And thank you for a fantastic talk. There's so much to ask about, so I'll just ask a few questions and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So I think one of the fascinating things about your book is you're talking about both kind of government kind of impacts as well as kind of non-governmental impacts on the questions that you examine. And so I wanted to start off with, something, there's so many things in your book that a lot of people aren't aware of, but I think especially when you talk about the CIA's role, that's something especially that people, I think, raise eyebrows and to people and elements in the State Department. And so if you could kind of elaborate kind of on both the U.S. government's role and the Israeli government role, and then I'll follow up with kind of non-governmental kind of impacts. Yeah.
Thank you. In terms of reading, by the way, there's now an audiobook, so that's another way to
Fantastic for long road trips or sleepless nights. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
so, hopefully it's so exciting. Anyway, so the book opens with a reform rabbi, who's a Palestinian refugee camp called Shatila, which is known for unfortunate reasons. And this reform rabbi is walking through this refugee camp, and he's so distressed by the poverty around him and people begging to go home. And I say, wow, this is not the 80s, it's not 2020, it's not today, it's 1953. And so it's this older reform rabbi, and then I kind of pivot to the fact that his trip and his book about his trip is paid for by the CIA. And he's not sure if he knew about it or not. I would guess that he didn't, but I don't know. So why is the CIA doing things like this? So the whole kind of, one could have written this book and not done government stuff. You could have just written this story and say, American Jews felt very emotional, and it would be a great book. But I have the IR background. I want the state and the role, and so the 50s are so important because the Eisenhower administration thinks that America should work harder to get a better relationship with the Arab world, and especially Egypt. So in the early to mid 50s, the Eisenhower administration wants to pressure Israel to accept a limited number of Palestinian refugees and to give some land to Arab states in the context of maybe not a peace agreement, but some sort of agreement between Egypt under Nasser and Israel. So this guy named Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, had tried to, worked with some sort of Christian groups to lobby, and the State Department to lobby Truman not to recognize Israel in '48. He fails. In the 50s, he's working for the CIA, and he says, this is important to actually push and get America to be less sort of pro-Israel, more understanding of the Arab side. And so he sets up CIA funding for this sort of constituted group that's sort of anti-Zionist, mostly Christian organization called American Friends of the Middle East. And so they really ramp up their activities as Eisenhower is trying to pressure Israel to make there be more sort of public understanding and sympathy for the Palestinian refugees, because obviously the American Jewish groups and others are very against this type of pressure on Israel. So that is why you have so much that's happening in the book in the mid-50s, because the CIA is pushing on this issue, and so it's becoming something Americans are learning about. The CIA is funding this anti-Zionist, some of the work of anti-Zionist rabbis. It also funds the creation of the first Arab student organization in the U.S. Secretly. Again, these are not people who knew that they were getting funding from the CIA sometimes, but it was used sort of as a tool for amplifying in terms of a form of domestic propaganda. And that doesn't mitigate the fact that there are Palestinian rights issues, that there are people who genuinely believe this, but it's an interesting fact I put in dialogue with the fact that the Arab League is beginning to ramp up these things, and that's why the American Jewish groups are reacting in new ways in 1956 that they weren't in 1951. So the Arab League plays a role, the CIA plays a role. It fades away as time goes on because America kind of gives up on wooing Nasser later in the 50s. This comes out in '67, the CIA funding of the group. But Israel is sort of the main governmental actor I talk about, and they're really dismissing American Jewish concerns about Arab and Palestinian issues, but also sidelining and trying to get people fired and succeeding, and also just the whole, what's intriguing is maybe not all the details, but this whole mentality of that, even though these people aren't saying things that are not provocative, they're like, even the fact that they're even trying to have an independent position is the problem. So, you get into questions about what are American Jewish interests? Are they whatever's in Israel's interest? And that's sort of what some American Jewish groups thought. But these are some American Jews who thought, no, American Jews should have a separate line of thought and potential protection policies, and that I think was the greater concern. So this is stuff I found in Jerusalem at the Israel State Archives, and I found Don Peretz's name, and like, whoa, this is all kind of coming together, and so that's kind of
that's fascinating, and I saw, how how perceived state interests in both the United States and Israel shaped, a lot of the questions that you look at. So I wanted to follow up with the kind of non-state actors and how they may or may not be influencing each other. So you were just speaking about the American Jewish group Brera in the 1970s and how they were kind of perhaps inspired, I don't know if that's the right word, by some of people in Israel like Lov Eliyav who were, really trying to pursue concern for Palestinian rights and as well as negotiations and so forth. So I'm kind of curious, just looking at those levels, if you can elaborate on that example and if you can see kind of mutually other examples of where they mutually influence each other, right? Because people falsely look at the Israeli population as monolithic or the American Jewish population as monolithic when each of them is so diverse. So how are they kind of groups within Israel other than the state and American Jewish groups other than the state influence kind of feeding off each other, reacting to each other, influencing one another, and maybe explain on the Brera or if there are other examples as well.
Yeah, so even your pronunciation, y'all's doing the Israeli pronunciation of, with the reish. How do you pronounce this group? It's an American Jewish group, and what's the correct pronunciation? Is Israeli Hebrew or American Hebrew? Which is kind of, even that gets into some of these questions about what is authentic Jewishness vis-a-vis Zionism in Israel.
I wasn't making any claims on that. That's just about actually.
I know, but I bring this up whenever I have someone do that. No, it's so what I do in the book is. So I did not go to grad school to do American Jewish history. I'm sorry, Kirsten. I'm nice. Yeah, you didn't either. But even American sort of domestic history wasn't interesting to me. But most of the literature on American Jews in Israel is written by American historians, especially American Jewish historians. So it's often like, okay, here are American Jews. They're looking over there. Here's how they feel. Here's their culture. And there are some really important works in that field. And I came to this as someone who went there to be an expert on Israel and the Middle East. And so I sort of was trying to write this book as something that goes both ways. And there are Israeli scholars who've written studies that are often more really just focused on diplomatic figures. And I'm trying to kind of look at this more broadly, look at it more internationally. And so, when I got to my last chapter, I couldn't find the same juicy diplomatic files as much as I could in the 50s. And I'm like, how do I make this all part of one story? And I'm looking in Brera's files in New York, and I'm seeing they're talking all the time about these guys named Mati Peled, who was a major general, these early voices in this Yuri of Neri, who I interviewed in his family, all these early these early Israeli peace activists, and they're republishing their material. And I interview some of them, and I read transcripts of interviews, and they met with a lot of these Israeli leftists, and that's how they came to the position. They didn't come to their position on an American college campus when these issues are coming up in the classroom or from leftist actors. There's people like Ian Lustig spent time in who's involved in these groups, spend time in Jerusalem. They study abroad in college, and they go to the West Bank, and they're like, there are Palestinians here, and the Israelis are like, well, maybe they should have a state. So I kind of say this needs to be viewed as an international story. There's not a one-way street on either of this. So I really try to get an idea of these groups that are trying in the 70s to create what we call the two-state solution, and they fail. Spoiler alert. And so I write that in a certain way. And I'm able to get the Palestinian and Israeli diplomatic thing in by these accounts that really show that this material was leaked by Israeli diplomats. So that's a little bit of a side note. But I think more broadly, if you look at American Jewish critics of Israeli policy, often, whether you're today or historically, a lot of them spend a lot of time over there. So I kind of end my conclusion. Don Parrott spent his years over there, which inspired him. Brera people did. And a lot of people who are involved in American Jewish conversations today about the Palestinians are people who came to their conclusions by conversations with Israelis who have left-wing positions, or by traveling and seeing things. So, I think as I talk about this book now, I'm not an expert on the present, but it's sort of, I think the lens that I'm using in this historical work can, weigh in on broader conversations that go back, from 48 to today.
And that was going to be my next
your next
question,
question,
actually,
yeah.
because I know, and I'm just keeping an eye on the time because I want to, take up some time, but leave also questions from the audience. But that was going to be my next question, which I think is on a lot of people's minds, is you have such fascinating, rich histories of the individuals, the organizations, the state influences up until 1978, I think. But we're all kind of curious as to what your insights would be if you have a volume 2, right, since 1978 or something like that. And I know you didn't have a chance to look at all that in depth, but I also know you're very knowledgeable on the later periods as well. So how would you kind of see kind of your main assumptions and insights kind of playing out in later periods when you do have, periods of peace negotiations on one hand, other periods of, strengthened occupation in other ways, right, at different times, fluctuations in both Israeli-Palestinian governments, new creations of American organizations. So not to address all of that, but how can your insights from the book help us understand not just today, but maybe some of picking a period or two or an event or two kind of since then that kind of your framework really allows us to gain greater insight from.
Yeah, so as a historian, I had to pick an end date, and
Right,
so
right.
78 made a lot of sense. So it comes about after this group comes about after 73 Beirut, when there's this kind of stalemate. Israel doesn't seem to know what it's doing with the Arab world. It gets attacked in 73. And so it's sort of the American Jewish Initiative saying that this is in Israel's interest. These people in Beirut, they're called anti-Zionists by their critics, but they're not. They're saying, actually, maybe not all of us are Zionists, but we care about Israel and a Palestinian state in Israel. And so things become more complicated in the late 70s because Israel is able to make a peace deal with the biggest Arab state, Egypt, without doing anything substantive for the Palestinians. And so, at different points in this history, there become different options and different dynamics with the Arab states at play. And sometimes American Jewish groups like, okay, Israel's got it covered, like they have things figured out. So when there's peace with the Arab world, that kind of divides it. Does Israel need to deal with the Palestinians to get peace? Or can they just sort of ignore the issue, like the right and many beyond the right all sort of wanted to at the time? So things get complicated in 82 when Israel invades Lebanon and lots of massacres, and so there's ebbs and flows in this. But I don't, the state, is certainly very interested in these things. I think sort of the American Zionist groups sort of have a better sense of what role they have to play in this, and sort of the position of, that Israel's interest as part of American Jewish interest becomes, of course, consensus amongst key American Jewish groups probably by the 60s or 70s. And so that's just sort of been constant. There's not this need like in the 50s being like, hey, your job is to do this. These questions really kind of continue. J Street comes about in the 2000s when I was in Keaton College, and there are lobbying groups still active that supports the Jewish state solution. And you're using a lot of these same rhetorics as Beirut, saying, it's the Israeli position a pro-Israel position to have a Palestinian state. So I would say you have two different sort of camps throughout this long stretch about American Jewish approaches to Palestinian rights. Some say, whether it's Beirut or J Street, we need to operate within the bounds of the American Jewish community, change the American Jewish community so they can help sort of bring about peace. And then you have some voices, even in my book that I don't mention, who I haven't really talked about today, who are saying what we need to do is listen to the Palestinians and sort of follow what the Palestinians are doing, and our main goal shouldn't be trying to change American Jewish politics, but to be advocating for the Palestinians as they want done. And I think that's actually become a lot bigger than it once was, like even within the past 15 years since, and that's part of that sort of the decline of this two-state solution as something, we have, that's its own kind of separate question, but, and so I think you still do have some groups that are very active, like Beirut, and that are, again, founded by people and involve people who spent lots of time over there and think it is in Israel's interest. But I see a lot of American Jewish groups on the left right now, which are sort of more moving into, this is all or nothing. We're going to push Israel harder and, get involved in supporting Palestinians in their own terms. So I think traditionally American Jews involved in these issues, whether it's the 70s or now, often feel like they're pushed into making that decision. Are you going to be active in trying to change American Jewry from within, or sort of supporting Palestinians from without? So that's some sort of both continuity, perhaps, in a certain way.
Well, thank you so much. I have so many more questions, but I want to let others have a chance to ask as well. So I'm going to have the audience ask questions, and I can pass this around to whoever who would like to ask the first question. Anybody?
What sort of leverage?
Wait, let me give you this so that, because then the people listening to the live stream can hear you.
Is this like, is it a matter of like, is this a matter of just, individual conscience, or is there actually leverage to be, that you're talking about, you say, the American Jewish, approach to Palestinian human rights? So is it just like, well, what is it just a matter of one's conscience, or is there leverage to be had? Say, you had that memo to the White House in the early 50s. I mean, is that real leverage, or is it, what is it? I don't.
Yeah. Well, there's multiple dynamics at play here, and something that I think is not constant, something that's dynamic throughout this history, is how much Israel feels it needs American Jewish groups and sort of support of American officials. So in the 1950s, when I'm focusing on this, or 48 afterward, Israel feels like it really needs American Jews. It needs American Jews because it's not broadly popular with the American public at large. It needs American Jews because it's in desperate financial straits after 48. A lot of the farmers are gone because they were Palestinian refugees. Israel has rations in the early 40s. It has hundreds of thousands of Jews coming in from the Arab world and elsewhere. It needs to resettle. So it's in a very difficult financial position in the 50s. So a group like the AJC, which is composed of many of America's wealthiest Jewish figures, and has access to a Republican White House after 53, which not a lot of American Jewish groups do at the time, is very important. And Israel perceives them as having leverage, and this not being something that they can play games with. What leverage do American Jewish groups have today is in some sense a more complicated story. Israel's a first world country. Its economy is in line with that of many in Western Europe. Obviously, the diplomatic and political support from the United States is important. But many on the Israeli right have come to feel that the most important political actor for Israel in America is evangelical Christians, and that if Israel loses the liberal American Jewish majority, 70% of American Jews tend to vote Democrat, so what? I mean, obviously, if the Democratic Party is in control, that's going to be an issue. But the attitude of Israeli leaders, who have sometimes almost seemed to weigh in on elections, has been sort of that American Jewry is ultimately going to assimilate. They're not so important anyway. So that's something that's static.
So it's faded, is what you're saying.
It's faded. I mean, a lot of this is perception, because we don't know how much leverage there is when leverage isn't used. But the stakes feel lower for Israel. I mean, we're in a different moment now, since October, but certainly if I was talking before that, definitely. And maybe beyond. We're in a moment where I don't even know what this, no one really knows, and even knows what's going on inside the Israeli cabinet's minds right now. But so that's sort of my take on that. Thank you for the question. Very interesting one.
Thank you for a very illuminating presentation. My name is Yoreh Kedem. I teach Hebrew here. Two questions.
Yeah.
One question is, in your estimation, what percentage of American Jewry this group? I think you need to turn off the media thing. Just touch the screen.
Touch the screen.
That's it. It will stop.
Okay, off.
Or not.
It says we need to touch it, but
I'm being censored.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first question is, what percentage of American Jewry do you feel this group represented back in the day?
So it's hard to say. So I didn't talk much about the anti-Zionist Jewish group, because I have a chapter on them. But we have a poll from December of 45. Basically, they asked American Jews, not if you're Zionist or not, but basically, do you support the creation of a Jewish state, or do you think that it's not good for American Jews? And 80% say that they support that Holocaust refugees should go there and that there needs to be, a state, and 10% say no, this is not good. So, and 10% don't know. So that's, again, before Israel's created. This anti-Zionist group claims to have 20,000 members in the 50s, which isn't a ton of people, but it's not nothing. There are synagogues that are founded in the 50s in Highland Park, Illinois, in parts of Texas and elsewhere that are supporting this sort of anti-Zionist position. Anti-Zionist not because they support Palestinians necessarily, but anti-Zionist because they don't like that Hebrew culture is taking a root in American Jewish life. They run Hebrew schools that sort of reject, Hava Nagila, which comes from, and all these sorts of, this idea of putting a flag up in your synagogue, and they're working against that. It's really hard to know. I think this kind of the assumption that American Jews are Zionist unless otherwise indicated. We don't actually have that question that's asked very much in polls. Are you a Zionist? What does a Zionist actually mean? Now it just means the same thing as being pro-Israel. But back then, it was the assumption that if you were a Zionist, you were a card-carrying Zionist, like you were part of one of these Zionist movements. I think these questions are often not so clear. Even if we did have polling data, we wouldn't know. I think Israel and Zionism from the 40s and even before slowly began to take up a more important part in American Jewish culture. At some point, the Reform movement and the conservative movement decided we need a prayer for Israel and a Siddurim in our prayer books. At some point, they decided they should put the Israeli flag up in many other synagogues. That didn't happen on May of 48. It happened gradually over the course of time. And someone should write a great dissertation on how exactly these things are taking place. I think a lot is changing, especially in the 60s, especially after 67. And, kind of anecdotally, like the vast majority of American Jews are supporting Israel after 67 in a very overtly political and Zionistic type way. Before, I think there's a lot of interesting questions and more digging on that. But what is the consensus? For American Zionist groups, the idea is if you can say you're speaking for all Jews in America, that's something powerful. For non-Zionists and anti-Zionists, that's troubling because if all Jews have the same position, that's like what the anti-Semites say. It's troubling loyalty-wise. So I don't have a great answer for you, but I have an interesting one. So hopefully that's good enough.
Thank you. The other question that I'd like to ask you is in the documents that you read.
Yes.
How do the Arabs or Palestinians that have become refugees, what words do they use to describe them? Because the word Palestinian is relatively new. Yeah. And a very famous American Jew, Golda Meir, said that there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. She's very famous for saying that. Yeah. So how early in those writings do you see the term Palestinian used to describe the refugees that they're describing? Because there's a historical significance here, right? The way that they're treated. Are they treated as Arabs that just basically went to another Arab country? Or are they Palestinian refugees that are a people?
Yeah, no, this is an interesting question. When I first started the dissertation, I have to do Palestinian Arab rights, and this group calls themselves Palestinian today. So in terms of my book title, in terms of the book, I sort of use things interchangeably. Predominantly in the 50s, we're talking the term Arab refugees used in Israeli and international American Jewish files. But the Palestinian, the refugees themselves, when they flee or kicked out of Haifa and move to Lebanon, they're not just called regular Arabs there; they're called Palestinians because they came from Mandate Palestine. So I think sort of the terms that they're using for themselves, even when they felt part of the Arab nationalist movement, are quite important. The book, I don't know if you saw the book from Don Peretz. His book is called Israel and the Palestine Arabs. So even then, this term Palestinian is not really used, but you need a term to designate these people because they're not just generic Arabs. It's not just like you can move one to one place or another. So it's a dance, and anyone who teaches about Israeli Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel, needs to deal with these questions. And I try to be sensitive to the fact that what people might call themselves today might be different than what they call themselves historically. But we do need to be careful, especially when we're getting the fine print, and we can in a book about what we mean. And the term that they're using predominantly is Arab.
Sorry. Thank you so much for a really great talk, and I can't wait to read the book. So I have two questions that initially I was thinking, I have a ton of questions, but the ones I want to ask, initially I was thinking they're very separate, but actually as I'm realizing it, I think there's a connection. So the first question I wanted to ask is about the people you spoke to, and your research in general. I'm fascinated by the woman inviting you to go look at this box of letters. So that is a great story, and I would love to hear more. But I'm actually interested in you talking to people, and I'm really curious how much people sort of felt, like in thinking about dissent, how much they felt shut down, how much they felt, what were their perceptions of the experiences that they'd had in terms of feeling shut down? How much did they feel that their voices or what they had done had a legacy or continued? And I think that actually connects to the second question that I had, which is that the groups that you have, that you described in the beginning from the American Jewish Committee, right, are really, really different from Brera. I'm going to say it wrong, but and so I'm curious: are there connections? Is there a legacy? Do people see themselves? Are these isolated sort of people sort of picking up at different eras, something, or is there connection, and is there sort of a thread of dissent that people perceive for themselves?
Yeah, great question. So a highlight looking back on my research, which I started this. I didn't know it was going to be my book, but I started 10 years ago this month, basically, the research that became this book. I started interviewing people a year or two later. And really, it was a highlight because I've talked to people, some of them who aren't around anymore. I went to Ramallah, I went to Arab town at the border in Lebanon and met really fascinating, interesting people, some of them who are no longer with us. They weren't always as fruitful as I would have liked, or they showed me maybe it wasn't a path. So I met with some Israeli officials who worked with Ben Gurion and Eshkol in Israel who are no longer alive, who basically told me, no, we didn't really care what the American Jews thought. And so that was interesting. That was helpful in that I didn't need what's their memory, but it kind of confirmed that maybe this isn't something I needed to look in certain avenues. That was early on, when I was really more Israel-focused and later. Met one of the Palestinians, the PLO figures, who met with American Jews. Like, that meeting wasn't important. I didn't know it became a huge thing that was used against them. But a lot of my conversations with American Jews. I was super lucky that a woman did all this oral history work and interviewed all these American Jewish peace activists. And I could draw a lot from that. And so I was able to find these collective biographies. They felt really shut down, and they felt often very vindicated because, a lot more American Jews came to their position, at least about the two-state solution, or also there are a lot more Jewish anti-Zionists than there were 60 years ago. And so a lot of them felt quite vindicated. A lot of them felt that they had such negative reactions to them. A lot of them felt, I met with someone a couple of weeks ago who was in Atlanta, the executive director of Brera. I sat down for coffee, and it was just, these were really bright, engaged American Jews who were in their 20s and 30s who were shut down and made like they were PLO pawns. Being called pro-PLO back then was like being called pro-Hamas now. And so a lot of them left Jewish life, Jewish political life because of that. So very negative. And your next question is how much back? So Don Peretz is on the senior board of Brera. So he's involved in all these things, and so I can always reference him even though he's less interesting when he's in his 50s. Everyone's more interesting in their 20s and they're traveling around doing all these things. I have all these emotional letters to his parents, and so he's throughout. But a lot of times they're not looking back, and someone else is coming out with a book, Marjorie Feld's book, which is similar. She's an American Jewish historian, so it's not the side transnational dynamic. But she says because of all this being shut down and silencing, people don't even remember that there are people before that, because there's not the continuity institutionally. So everyone's reinventing the wheel, and like not looking back at this history. What I mentioned in the conclusion is the way in which a lot of Jewish anti-Zionists and critics of Israel today sometimes hearken to the Bund. So the Bund, the Jewish Labor Bund, was a Yiddish socialist organization in Eastern Europe that believed in Jewish peoplehood and even Jewish nationalism maybe, but believed that Jews' future was in Eastern Europe. Obviously, unfortunately, Jews didn't have the future in Eastern Europe that they had hoped they'd have. But sort of the anti-Zionism and non-Zionism of these Yiddish-speaking socialists has been very inspiring to some on left. And there's some person's writing a book on this who's not really a historian. But Yiddish culture is I think it provides for Jews critical of Israel maybe a separate source of Jewish authenticity, and so a bigger cultural world that's of interest. But the truth is, outside of the Bund, a lot of the Yiddish sphere is Zionist historically, and there's sort of this misperception that the Yiddishists, people who are interested in studying Yiddish in Brooklyn right now, like I want to counterweight, I want to embrace this history, the workman's circle, and all these other, and they, the truth is it's more complicated than that. So that's quite interesting. Will anyone read this book and find, that these stories resonate for them? I think they will find maybe resonance. They will think more deeply, whether they're people who support two-state solution or they're anti-Zionist. Well, it would be something that they truly influences. It doesn't provide. None of these people sort of provide maybe like a rich cultural universe that I think a lot of people long for. Whether that rich cultural universe is in Hebrew studies of Zionism or in Yiddishism and anti-Zionism. So, but great questions.
Hi, so my question is, if you were to continue this research and write a second part to this book that includes present-day events in the Middle East, would you still maintain such a strong perspective from Jewish people all throughout, or would you be more equitable towards Palestinian voices, as today's media has given us access to the atrocities committed by the IDF as one example, and shown us that the creation of people who have become accidental reporters out of circumstances, reporting on what's happening in the Middle East?
Yeah, it would definitely be quite different. I felt so fortunate to have a chapter that does deal with a Palestinian voice, Fayez Sayegh, whose archives happened to be, because his wife was he's a Palestinian, he lived here till 1980. His archives were in Utah because his wife was from Utah. His daughter has been very helpful to me in my research as well. But the fact of the matter is, if you're looking at the 50s, 60s, 70s, there aren't a lot of Palestinian voices in the American public discourse. Sayegh is one of them, Edward Said emerges, but sort of these people are viewed as foreigners, even unfortunately at the time period. And even Arab Americans who are citizens are often not viewed as authentically American at the time. So I think a background to this story is exactly what you talk about, the lack of access that Arabs, Palestinians, others have in mainstream American Jewish discourse, and the fact that it falls on people like Don Paris and William Zuckerman to, in their mild way, bring this into the conversation. I mean, something that's drastically different now is just the level of exposure that Americans, period, today, every decade more than the last, is exposure to Palestinians who are speaking in their own terms. It's in the era of social media and the internet, I don't even know how to write history because it's so big. There's just so many voices. You certainly can't focus in to a certain sense the way I do. But no, I think part of the reason why there's so much more. Some people are saying there's more Jews who are critical of Israel today because they're distancing from Israel, because they're, because they're their friends, or because they're assimilated, or they're less Jewish, or the Holocaust is further. And no, I think a lot of it's because they're hearing more about Palestinian voices, whether that's from going over there or having Palestinians live down the hall from them in Case Hall or wherever else, or because of what they're seeing on the internet or elsewhere. So it's definitely a totally different story from that perspective. And I think that's something that really changes only in the internet age. And so I think you probably, if I were to carry this on in the 80s, you probably wouldn't see that change nearly as much. You know, I engage a little bit with Arab American historians, and you know, I think really that the switch in which they're becoming, Arab Americans are getting more established voices, is really only recent as well. So, yeah, great question.
Anybody else? Any other questions?
No one has something. I'll ask another question, and then hopefully others will feel like it too. So in several of your answers, you were kind of differentiating kind of those who are critical of Israel as those who could be, you know, anti-Zionist or could be alienated or, you know, what have you. But of course, I know you know that a lot of people, or I would suggest, I don't know what the percentage is either, that let's say many Jewish Americans and many Israelis themselves, you know, actually are critical because they care. And you mentioned that earlier in your lecture, because of the connection, or because they want the country to be better, because they care about it, just like you would as an American, right, be critical of your government. And so, right, so even in our country, I think in the United States and in Israel, it's kind of the right that tries to capture kind of what patriotism is, right, and tries to portray others as kind of traitors. And actually in both countries, I think you have people who are trying to recapture, right, no, it's actually because you care about a country that you're critical of it and want it to be better. So I kind of heard that in your lecture, but then in some of your answers, it got more into this dichotomy of whether one is critical or not critical, and what camp that means you're in. And I just wanted you to kind of unpack that or complexify that. Yeah.
That's really helpful. So, you know, some people are like, oh, your book is about anti-Zionist Jews. And it's partially, you know, I have chapters. I don't use the term anti-Zionist for anyone who doesn't use that term themselves, because it's often used for people who don't consider themselves that, interpret them. I don't use the term Zionist for anyone who doesn't use that term themselves, because it's also often, you know, used in that negative way. So yeah, I think we need to be a lot more, you know, I almost use the verb way of like, okay, people who are criticizing Israeli policy or criticizing Israel. And I think there's, you know, greater connections between those, you know, different groups than one might think initially. I think a lot of people are very conflicted. I think more now than ever, you know, coming out of October, of people who feel, you know, they're committed to this idea or of Israel or of Jews, and also think what's happening is terrible. And we live in a media environment where the less nuanced, the better. You know, I'm not on Twitter. I'm not really actively, you know, I don't tweet very much. But if I did, it wouldn't get retweeted very much, because, you know, it's kind of just these cycles. So I think there's so much nuance that gets painted over, not just in the American Jewish community, but often in the Arab American community and the American Muslim community. You know, I think what's another thing that's really important about this period and some periods in my work, some periods of the work, is there seems to be this dichotomy. It seems like when the two-state solution is more on the table, it's like, okay, there's a way that can be good for everyone. And, you know, when I was, you know, a student 15 years ago, you know, the conversation was about the occupation, and, you know, about Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, and Israel sort of denying, you know, rights to people living there. And now it's more about, you know, decolonization and the sort of fundamentals of Zionism. And, you know, there's maybe effort to think, okay, that's all about people being more radical today, people being more leftist, like changes in views about colonization, decolonization. That's part of it. But a big part of that is because of various actors on both sides, we have a situation where neither of them seem to want to compromise into this solution, and so it is a winner. It is a winner-take-all game. I Yeah, I mean, I generally try to move away from these sorts of labels until people force me to use them, because more descriptive terms, I think, do us something helpful as well.
Thank you so much. Anybody else? Yeah, I'm going to give you.
I was wondering if you can say something about why, when Israel was set up as a state, why a Palestinian state wasn't set up at the same time.
Yeah. So, the book goes, it covers this period of 47, 48 when Don Peretz is in, Mandate Palestine. The UN, the majority position of the United Nations committee puts and it votes on this idea of partitioning the land into two states, a Jewish state which would have taken up 55% of Mandate Palestine, an Arab state for 45%. The Zionist community is kind of split on this, but the labor establishment, Ben Gurion, a lot of Jews celebrate this is a Jewish state. The Arab side is opposed to this. For them, why should they, from their perspective, why should they compromise? They view this as like some on the Israeli, Zionist right. This is all our land. Why should we give up the majority of it? And so the leadership in Mandate Palestine and Arab states is very strongly opposed to that. If they, there's no enforcement mechanism by the United Nations to set up these states. There begins to be essentially a civil war because the Arabs are in Mandate Palestine are so upset about the situation. It becomes a regional war. The Palestinian refugee issue comes about. People flee, people are kicked out. And ultimately, in aftermath of the war, Arab armies are controlling about 22% of Mandate Palestine, what we call the West Bank, occupied by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, occupied by Egypt. And they could have done something as Arab states to create a smaller Palestinian state, but they didn't view that as being in their interests. There's very complex reasons for why a Palestinian state wasn't set up, partially because they didn't want part of the land. They wanted, most of them wanted the whole land. There's always dissenting voices on anything. And also because of the role of Arab states. This isn't a focus on, this isn't meant to be the only book you read about the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It's a focused, a story. But I end by talking about Fayez Saeg, this Palestinian character, who's so disappointed, by the Arab states. He works for Arab states in the Arab League, and they ultimately fail him every time. The book isn't about, the book isn't, you can find books about Arab failure of the Palestinian cause. This isn't that book, but I do mention it because it is part of this story as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was such a fabulous talk, and I also cannot wait to read the book. I'm intrigued by the fact that the period that you cover is also a period in which there are some massive internal changes within American Jewish life, right? With the move to suburbia, the sort of big institution of the suburban synagogue, right? The kind of the conservative movement really becoming a sort of major force within American Jewry. And I'm wondering, how does the process that you map in the book around the sort of authentic flowering of American Jewish dissent, shall we say, and the suppression of that dissent, does it map at all onto any of the internal changes that are happening within American Jewry around suburbanization and affluence, Jewish involvement in things like redlining, and all the things that we know about American Jewish history during the 1950s and 60s?
Yeah, this is why some of the book was so hard to write, because I had to engage in all these different fields: Arab American history, American Jewish history, the Cold War, but also I think has made it interesting to so many people because I touch on all this. So, American as distance emerges from Jewish migration from Eastern Europe and the role of ethnic neighborhoods and Yiddish culture being in people's daily life, I think American Jews are increasingly struggling quietly to figure out what being Jewish is all about. What is the substance? What is living Jewish culture? Yiddish and European culture are dying in the eyes of many. And so there's a question: if you're a summer camp counselor Or what games do you play with your campers? And what's more, do you want to do something about the Yiddish land or about Israel? What if you want to do a dance at your wedding? If by the way, if you're Jewish, 150 years ago, no one knew about Hav Nagila or the Hora. These are things that grew in Ottoman and Mandate Palestine and became part of American Jewish culture later. So American Jewry, as the 50s became the 60s, is increasingly becoming invested in Zionism and viewing it as part of their own identity. And so I think some of the conversations that I highlight that are super fascinating in the 50s about sort of that assumes some difference and some separation are less and less relevant as time goes on. There aren't these ethnic, there's a little bit about sort of dynamics between the Black Power movement, and which takes up the Palestinian cause, assumptions that that's about anti-Semitism, assumptions that that's about, urban issues, which is not irrelevant, but the Black Power movement's very interested in Palestine. Malcolm X went to Gaza. There's, international and domestic dynamics of that, which are part of the story. In the 70s, I talked about Beira here, about its role in the two-state solution, advocating for it. But it was also talking about revitalizing American Jewish life. It had two goals. One is related to its peace program in Israel, but it's also feeling like in the suburbs, American Jewish identity is becoming empty and vapid, and Israel plays a role in that, but also like, what are we doing? It's very intertwined with the Havurah movement. It's very entwined with a lot of these questions about what it means to be Jewish at a time when a lot of Jews, are in many ways like very similar to other educated Christian white Americans, aren't particularly religious in general. And so it's a lot of this, whether I'm talking about the 70s and Beira, and today, activism on multiple signs is a search to figure out what's the meaning of being Jewish. And you have that anti-Zionist today making the case that their position is a meaningful way of being Jewish, and you have people on multiple sides of this issue. So it's, I draw from a lot of the work of American Jewish historians, in thinking about what this means. So yeah, thank you.
Can I ride on this question? The basic assumption of Zionists was rejecting of the diaspora. And therefore, really, when Ben-Gurion, or when somebody says, I don't really care what American Jews thought about this issue, they many times really didn't want to care. So I think that one of the things that comes out of Laura's question and about your presentation is a divergence in what it means to be Jewish between being Israeli and Jewish and being American and Jewish. Those are very different kind of Jewishisms to an extent. So I think that one of the things that I hear in your presentation is that you can see the roots of this divergence already happening back then. But if, again, we bring it till today, when, certain things, certain parts of the Israeli government outwardly reject American Jewry because they're not really Jews in their opinion. Such as the Orthodox parties, for example, who don't accept Reform and conservative Judaism as real forms of Judaism. So the question is, if this process is ongoing, is the issue of Palestinians and Israel something that's leading to more unification or more separation between these two largest Jewish communities in the world?
Yeah. Ben-Gurion didn't care sort of what they thought to a certain extent, but he actually cared a lot about these American Jews. He spent hours talking to anti-Zionist Jews, meeting with these non-Zionists, and the whole ethnic and ethno-national connection was very important to him. There's a distrust in that generation for non-Jews. Today, if you're John Hagee, you're going to much more welcomed by the prime minister, a Christian, right-wing Christian, than Noam Chomsky or in Israel today. So in a sense, there's changes in what Zionism means, changes in what the diaspora means, the significance, and there's a warmness, interesting. bigger and full and this comes up in some of those conversations. You know, I think a lot, you kind of mentioned about these debates. I think some of these separation, these issues of unity and separation come out in my book in the 50s because they're before the sort of great tide of Zionism that comes in the 60s to whenever you want to say it ends, or maybe never ends, after 67. And you have behind the scenes, not all behind the scenes, all these really interesting conversations about difference. There's an op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday that in toward the end talked about my book actually, and this person is basically reminiscing about he's very opposed to Israeli policy, to say the least. He's a journalist who covered the Bosnian War. But he sort of is talking about American Jewish identity that is separate from Israel's identity. There's been, you know, a broad efforts and genuine feelings of the idea that we are one, that all Jews have the same values, the same interests, and that is something that seemed much more authentic to a broader group of people in the 60s and 70s, when, you know, there's the kibbutzim, and, you know, even if people like Noam Chomsky and young Bernie Sanders didn't agree with all of Israel's Arab policies, the values of the kibbutzim, collectivity, whatever, and now you look at some of these values, you know, young Jews in America are more likely to be liberal, more likely to be upset about Israel's policies than older generations. Young Jews in Israel tend to be the most right-wing group. So, you know, if you think about a 20-year-old who's in Israel in 1965, they're going to have a lot more to talk about, bond over, you know, with an Israeli their age, perhaps in terms of certain values. You know, maybe there's more cultural connections in some way today than a 20-year-old, the average 20-year-old from both sides today. So are we entering, I think we are, frankly, entering where more American Jews are contemplating about, you know, what does shared values mean? What do we have in common? You know, I think some of that might be hidden by the fact that the response to the war has been so challenging for American Jews, you know, negatively toward Israel, but also toward American Jews, that sort of has hidden, I think, some of the angst within and deep reflection. And I think, and I've written this in some material I've written since October, that, you know, American Jews are feeling in way more alone than ever before, and that leads them to, in some ways, to be more connected to Israel, but also feel more disconnected from its policies than ever before. And in a way, this is the way things were headed before, and all the more extreme now. And yeah, I mean, I don't see, you know, I don't see things getting any easier for pretty much, you know, anyone, and it's really unfortunate. I'll end on a lighter note if there's no other questions. But
maybe we'll give you some
unless you have,
comments,
yeah,
or
unless you have another question.
Would you like to make some closing remarks?
I'll just say, you know, I know the book has resonated to different people in different ways, which I think is, you know, welcome. And I wish that we were in this sort of extremely challenging time. I mean, the best sort of thing I can come up with in a time when everything's looking so negative is, you know, we never know what's going to happen. You know, we never know when the Soviet Union falls. Like, you never know when some leader or some grassroots are going to do something great to change the tide. Usually when things unexpected happen, they're bad, but sometimes they're good. But no, it's really sort of hard to look at indicators and feel good about the present and future, especially when thousands of people are dying. But yeah, hopefully the future history will surprise us. So anyway, thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you so much
and,
for
yeah.
coming back to
Yes.
Madison.